Thank you very much again, Scott, for having accepted the invitation. It's really my pleasure to talk to you and to have read the book. So if you don't mind, I will start with some introduction about you, some brief introduction, and then without further ado, I will start with the questions. Scott Aikin is an American philosopher and assistant professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, where he also holds a joint appointment in classics. He earned an MA in philosophy from the University of Montana in 1999. Back then I was 19, I think. Yeah. And a PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt University in 2006. His principal areas of research are epistemology, argumentation theory, ancient philosophy, and pragmatism. So among his authored books are Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement with Robert Hollis, 2014. Reasonable Atheism, with Robert Hollis, if I'm not wrong, 2011. Pragmatism, A Guide for the Perplexed, 2008. Pragmatism, Pluralism, and Natural Philosophy. And Why We Argue, A Guide to Political Disagreement. I think you have two books on argument, and my first question is that you seem to mean something specific by argument, not bickering or squibbling or quarrel noisily over a trivial matter. As you say, I'm quoting you, argument is not what people often say it is. Argument is not merely fighting with words, nor is it simply a competition for verbal dominance over others, nor is it merely the art of persuasion. Argument is ultimately an attempt to examine beliefs with others by means of our reasons and evidence. None of those other conceptions of argument, end of quote. So Scott, what is an argument in the end, and what brought you to write or devote actually two books on it?
So thank you so much for having me on. First, Madi, I'm a great admirer of this platform. I'm a great admirer of the work that you've done. Really high quality interviews. Really admire really admire the work that you've put in.
Thanks a lot.
So hope that I'm up to the standard here. To your question, what's argument? There are really kind of two good models that we've got for what arguments are. One of them is, you might say, a kind of a premise-conclusion arrangement, where arguments are relations between pieces of information. Some pieces of information, your premises, support the conclusion. Those premises should be true. The support relation should transmit that truth in some capacity to your conclusion, and that's what support is. And so whenever we give arguments, what you do is you give those reasons, and the thought is that it's supposed to be towards that conclusion. But additionally, arguments are not just relations between abstract objects like propositions, sentences, or something like that. They are events that occur between people, and they're bits of communication that we have, and that there are rules for not just being able to assess whether or not the premises support conclusions, but as to whether or not we are actually answering each other, and whether or not we're addressing the concerns, the objections, and the sides and the points of view that necessitated the arguments. Often arguments arise because of the fact that we've got questions, we've got disagreements, and those, what we might call pragmatic background requirements or background conditions for arguments, also provide us with reasons for thinking that a mere quarrel may be an occasion for an argument. So we may have a disagreement, and we may have had words, or we might have even had some sort of attempt at a kind of dominance over each other. But a successful argument is, or arguments in general, are evaluated, are normatively constrained enterprises that we can say, even if you successfully dominated another person in a verbal exchange, we could still say those were bad arguments. And so we can, the importance is being able to make that distinction between the proper exchanges of reasons that we can have between people and evaluating those and distinguishing that off from all of the other things that we do. And again, this isn't to say that you might say, sometimes whenever we say that we had an argument, really it was just an airing of grievances. Those are perfectly good things to do sometimes. Sometimes you just need to let off some steam at the other person. but that's not the normatively defined thing that we're doing whenever we exchange reasons. And so recognizing that there are lots of things that we do that we, in, you might say, ordinary discourse call argument. Argument in the more restricted sense is this normative enterprise of exchanging reasons that themselves have to have a certain kind of structure, but also need to sort of meet, not just sort of meet, need to meet other pragmatic, interpersonal, communicative objectives that we've got with each other, addressing an issue, answering a question, handling concerns, and even, you might say, just being able to sort of make clear what exactly we're saying, what exactly the proposals are that we're looking at. Now, what interested me in argument at the very beginning was that I was, at least when I was younger, was a particularly, maybe still, a particularly disputatious person. I thought that I knew better than everybody else. It's a common thing that happens among young men. And so, but one of the funny things that I found was that it wasn't just in that sort of thinking that I knew better than others. It was in my interest in, and my surprise, in being corrected and finding out that I was wrong and that others knew better, and how that was achieved. And some of it was just the fact that it wasn't that I was just dominated, or they had a degree that I didn't have. It was that they managed information and showed me something. And that accessibility of, you might say, the exercise of reason, of saying, being able to go from the place where we say we disagree and we think that reason is on your side, to then saying, not just saying, but seeing a path from going from that to then being able to say, no, I need to actually rethink what I said, being able to understand a correction. And one of the strange things about it all is that even before I started understanding anything about argument, I thought I was already really good at it. It's a strange phenomenon, right? Nobody ever thinks that they start off like being really good at chemistry, right? Nobody ever thinks that they starts off thinking that they're really good at some specialized thing. But a funny thing happens with us, which is that we already think that we're pretty good at reasoning before we've even started studying, before we've even started understanding it. And that's a strange illusion. And there was a number of humbling events in my life as a young man, and then in college, and then further on in graduate school, where I was regularly learning that lesson, where I wasn't just wrong, but I could somehow still be reached, right? That I could still be reached and corrected and brought back around. And that wasn't just, again, something that I felt like I could do for others, that it was that others could do that for me. And that exercise of not just arranging propositions, but also submitting those to the scrutiny and exchange with others, was a way for me to not only play a role in helping others not believe their own bullshit, but so that I didn't either. And so thinking of logic, thinking of critical thinking as a self-defense course, of intellectual self-defense, is correct. But it's not just intellectual self-defense against others. It's intellectual self-defense against yourself.
Right.
The lazy dogmatisms, the happy and comfortable truths that you've uncritically thought about, but think are obviously true. Critical thinking allows you to be able to uncover that, and allows you certain skills to be able to be corrected by others.
Right. Wonderful. So Scott, I repeat the same question from the beginning of the book. We are creatures for whom argument over big questions is inescapable. Some would say that it is irresistible, yet it seems, without termination. To put the matter succinctly, we are incurable arguers. The question is why we bother, especially in the quasi-post-truth age, to argue.
Well, yeah, so I think that the first off is that even after the post-truth, so even if we consider this under the conditions of post-truth suspicions that we have with regards to each other and with regards to our sources of information, we still ask big questions. And so even the skeptics. So, I mean, if we say, look, we're in a post-truth age, we're all kind of got a jaded or jaundiced view of the sources of information, or certainly the sources that others give us. The skeptics themselves, that skeptical attitude toward our information and towards our capacity to be able to process it, the skeptics themselves still thought that inquiry was the only way to be able to maintain either that view. So in some ways, even the attitude of this is a post-truth age is nevertheless a product of our critical thinking, of us engaging with each other, of us trying to uncover certain spots where we've not been particularly reflective. And so even that is something that's nevertheless a product of argument. And the other part of it is that it looks like big questions are ones that we can't really avoid asking and thinking, and especially thinking that we've got pretty decent answers. And so even under the conditions of post-truth, people still will say, okay, well then I'm going to cling to the things that I like. But it does look like they still need to be able to say, they've survived some kind of scrutiny. They are the kinds of things that I can look back on and say, okay, I should have chosen this instead of that. So even if you don't think that you can successfully defend yourself against all comers, you still need to be able to think that you've done okay. And you still need to be able to be around other folks that you think are doing okay with their reflection on them. In some ways, that's a kind of maybe a way of thinking about ourselves as having a kind of rational dignity. That even whenever we're not so sure that we're going to be able to get to the truth, we still need to be able to look at ourselves as having done our right best. And a reality is that it's really hard to think that you've done your right best if you haven't subjected your views to the critical eye of others.
Right, beautiful, great. So, I mean, again, in the beginning of the book, you name 3 components, namely rhetorical, material, and logical success in an argument. So I quote you, insofar as we are interested here in fallacy detection, we are concerned to identify a range of argumentative failures that are perhaps best described as dialectical fallacies. Scott, what are the fallacies and what are dialectical fallacies? I know it's a very large question. You have
right.
Chapter just in a nutshell.
So the concept of a dialectical. So what's an important thing is that maybe let's distinguish. Dialectical fallacies are best discussed or sort of framed in contrast to non-dialectical fallacies. So let's start with non-dialectical fallacies and then look at dialectical ones. So a non-dialectical fallacy is a fallacy that you can kind of do on your own. And so a hasty generalization doesn't require another arguer. You can make a hasty generalization about ducks without there being another person for you to make that inference. And the same thing goes with a lot of other kinds of bad inferences. They're just bad relations between premises and conclusions. So the fallacy of asserting the consequent. For example, all bachelors are male. Someone's a male, Sammy is a male, so therefore Sammy is a bachelor is an invalid inference. Again, you can do that without any other reasons. So those are, you might say, just bad fits between premises and conclusions that are non-dialectical. Those are just purely bad relations between premises and conclusions where it just doesn't follow. Dialectical fallacies are, you might say, they are takes two to tango fallacies. It requires another arguer for you to be reasoning about, and for you to then, on the basis of your reasoning about them, then have reasons to make inferences about their reasons. So a very simple example is the straw man fallacy. The straw man fallacy is one where you represent another reasoner's commitments, their arguments or their conclusions or the things that they say, and you make inferences about the conclusion on the basis of the views that others have. Now, the problem is that, and you make really just inferences about like the quality of their case. Now, the issue is that that's not merely just an error in reasoning. So if I represent you as having terrible reasons, and I criticize those terrible reasons, that in some ways is an excellent bit of information, but it just has to be accurate about you. The problem with the straw man fallacy is that it's just simply not accurate about the reasons that you gave, that it's a kind of dialectical miss. I construct, again, according to the metaphor, a straw opponent and defeat that opponent, perhaps legitimately. It's a correct defeat over this very bad view. The problem is that it wasn't the view that you had. And so what makes it a dialectical fallacy is that I failed to engage with you and the concerns that you have on the issue. I have successfully defeated another view, right? And so the conclusion then is that, one, again, we can go back and say there's still a formal or a non-dialectical conclusion, which is just because you've defeated a bad view doesn't mean that you're right on the issue, correct? But there's an extra error in it, and it's the error of the fact that you haven't addressed the other person with whom you're disagreeing. And the whole point of all of this public and dialectical exchange is for you to submit your views and them to submit their views to the exchange of reasons. And you've just failed to do that with the straw. You've defeated a view that they knew already was wrong.
Right.
And so there's a second kind of error. There's the failure of transmission of truth from premises to conclusions, or just a failure of the premises to be true. But then there's also the defeat of, you might say, again, this public interpersonal exchange of reasons that the whole point of the exchange was supposed to be about, namely that we're best able to see the truth when and be confident that we're grasping it correctly whenever our reasons have survived the scrutiny of our fellows. If we don't actually respond to the reasons that our fellows give, we've defeated that purpose.
Right, great. Scott, I have a paragraph of the book to read. Just, I don't have any question. I would be thankful if you just like expand it. So when we engage in an argument, we are not looking only for a formal demonstration of the truth of our conclusion. We are also looking to address questions, resolve disagreements, move inquiry along, and find out new things. More importantly, we are often attempting to address others, to engage with those with whom we disagree, and to settle disputes with them. To be sure, the formal criteria held, but they are not all there is to succeed in argument. We need a conception of argumentative success that goes beyond the formal properties. Actually, it is what you explained right now, but what is the
I got more to add. Yeah, so I think boy, that's a really you chose some meaty ones there. So I think the seeing that formal properties of proofs are insufficient, it can start with just the simple fact that an argument with the conclusion in its premises is valid. And so again, the validity is, you might say, the sort of the gold standard for the formal quality of a proof. And that's that the truth of the premises guaranteed the truth of the conclusion. And if your conclusion is among your premises, then by the law of non-contradiction, the truth of your premises has guaranteed the truth of the premises have guaranteed the truth of the conclusion.
Sorry, Scott, I would be thankful if you just stay a bit closer to the microphone. Sometimes I don't.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So,
thank you.
So again, to repeat, if you have an argument that has its conclusion among its premises, it will live up to the criterion of validity, because again, the criterion of validity is that the truth of the conclusions are guaranteed by the truth of the premises.
Right.
And so if the conclusion is among the premises, then of course that circular argument will be valid. So what we reveal when we see that circular arguments are formally acceptable given a sort of a broad conception of validity, but they're, you might say, dialectically failures because they fail to address a question. The reason why we have the conclusion of the argument is because of the fact that that was the thing in question. And so you shouldn't get to play a role in the premises. And even if it's true, now again, even if it's true, it still shouldn't get to play a role in the premises because it's the thing in question. That's why we call it begging the question, those circular arguments. And so notice, by the way, that invoking the notion of a question is that we're invoking not just the people who believe that that proposition is true. We're invoking people who have a doubt, who are not sure about the thing in question. So by saying that we've begged the question, what we've done is we've invoked an audience that's already not sure about one of the premises of that argument, namely the premise that is also the conclusion. And so begging the question, that the contrast between formal and dialectical criteria can be best pictured by just the simple fact that circular arguments are, in again, this broad validity sense of formally acceptable, are formally acceptable. And even ones that are true, that have got true conclusions, are going to even meet even higher standard of what's called soundness, which is a valid argument with true premises. The problem is that it fails to do an interpersonal thing, which is we were subjecting the reasons that we have for that conclusion. And so we need to have something that's not, we need to, in some ways, to see that the conclusion is true, we cannot look directly at it. It's a weird phenomenon especially about how reasoning has to work. In order for the reasoning to work, you can't look directly at the thing that you're trying to reason about. You have to look at the things that take you there. And those cannot always be the thing that's in question. They have to be things that in some ways are structurally connected to it. And in cases where you've got someone who denies the truth that you're trying to reason to, you have to recognize just how difficult it is for those connections to be available to them. Because if they deny the thing that you're trying to reason to, they might actually find the other things that you think are obviously taking you to them also objectionable. A very simple example is, again, we could just imagine someone denying the existence of a God, and then someone says, well, but everything written in this holy book is true, right? And it says that God exists, so therefore we're okay. Now that again isn't a case where the conclusion is among the premises, but it's a case where one of the premises clearly does depend on one of the conclusions being true. So in those sorts of cases, what we do is we again see that it's not just a matter of being right or even having the formal relations between premises and conclusions to be able to take us and for us to be able to reason successfully. We need to be sensitive to where the doubts are about the things that we're trying to reason to. And we can't, and if we are inattentive to those doubts, our arguments are going to fail, not for formal reasons, but for these informal dialectical reasons. And if the whole point of argument is, again, subjecting your reasoning to the scrutiny of your fellows, that's a failure.
Right. Wonderful. There is another smaller, actually, part of the book. I'm just quoting. The question that you're posing is that Mill's principle said that he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. Does this entail that one must give serious consideration to all opponents, no matter how bizarre, crazy, or offensive they might be?
Yeah. So yeah, Millian, I might call it the Millian liberal principle of inquiry, has got heavy burdens along with it. And Mill had thought of this as a set of individual responsibilities. But I think that it can be, I think that liberal principle can be liberalized. And one reason is that we can have a distribution of epistemic or intellectual or argumentative labor. You can't swing at every ball. You can believe that, say, for example, that the world is flat, and I think with good reason, but may not be able to answer every argument given by a flat Earth skeptic, or someone who's a skeptic about the world being round and who is a flat earther. So they can have lots of arguments, and you may not be able to answer all of them. The challenge, though, is what we might call, there's the sort of the homework problem. And the homework problem is that there are crackpots aplenty, and you just if the responsibility is to be able to answer all of them, you're never going to be able to live up to it with regards to pretty much any of the sort of substantive commitments that we've got. So we call that the homework problem. And to the homework problem, I think, again, with this distribution of epistemic labor is important, which is we can have people, there are people out there who do go out and debunk them, right? And chase them down. And the objective then is supposed to say something like, look, if we're all intellectually honest, some of these arguments are going to eventually come back up to us if we fail to debunk them. But there's another one, which is what we might call the identity problem, because there are other bits of argument out there that don't just touch on, you might say, sort of important commitments, but ones that, in considering them, the only cost one pays is one's time to chase them down. There are other kinds of arguments out there that one doesn't just pay with costs, but one pays with certain kinds of challenges and structural indignities to one's identity. So, for example, taking up with every racist theory of intelligence is not the responsibility of every person of color who believes that they deserve equal opportunities for educational advancement. Taking up with every sexist account of women's capacities is not the responsibility of every woman who believes that they deserve equal opportunities also. And taking up with every homophobic or transphobic attitude and argument is not the responsibility of every trans person who believes that they deserve equal rights. But those commitments should be answered. And there are a couple intersecting reasons as to why they should be. One is that if we don't answer them, again, not everyone has to answer them, and it's not everyone's responsibility to know of them. But if we do not answer them, and we say that we do it out of principle, those who hold those views are, one, not going to be reached and their minds aren't going to be changed. But moreover, we in not engaging them create a larger echo chamber for them. And they're not getting actually the pushback that they need to be able to change their minds. And I mean, it's on the one hand an onerous task, and one that I've taken up given the privilege that I have with the identities that intersect with me, that I'm white, I'm male, and I'm cisgendered and heterosexual. I don't suffer a lot of those slings and arrows whenever I have to take up with those. But I will very gladly address and handle those transphobic and racist and sexist arguments. And why? One, again, the folks who hold those views are only going to be more radicalized if they're not answered. Moreover, they're going to take the avoidance of their views as evidence of the fact that we don't have a good response to them. They will take the fact that they have been shut out as evidence, what we might call meta-evidence, that there are no good replies to them. And they will then, as a consequence, be more sure of their views. So they will not have counter evidence, and they will think that they actually have evidence that their evidence is better. And as a consequence, for the sake of, you might say, the intellectual milieu, right? A kind of garbage work that we need to do. And it's garbage work that in some ways we all must do, but we all must do given appropriate distributions of intellectual labor. Mm-hmm. And so given people's identity, you actually need to do some garbage work in your own communities. Now, again, there are some communities that have got a lot worse garbage work to be done, but we need to be on the lookout for the garbage work that's appropriate for us. And right. So even folks with and again, I'm going to say something a little bit controversial, but I think that even folks with identities that suffer under oppression still have got, you might say, some cleanup work that they need to do, even internal to their communities. Sure. Because there are still going to be silos of again, because they have repressed voices, they're not going to have the reasons that they need to be able to have for their own liberation. And they need to be working on that also. They need to be given the space to be able to work on it also. But the important thing is that the work of being able to root out bad reasoning is something that we all have got. But whether or not it's something that we have to do individually for every bad view out there, that's not the case.
True. I'll go back to this question of those who are, like, let's say, marginalized later. But now, related to what you just said, the next question is like more focused on this beautiful concept in the book, like civic-mindedness. So, as you say, again, quoting you, others, and in relying on others, we seek not only a mutual benefit, but a common benefit, a benefit that accrues to us. In other words, properly ordered social relations aim at a common good among those who participate in the relation, end of quote. Later on, you add that, again, a mark of civic-mindedness is that even those not wronged by an infraction can and will object to it, end of quote. What is this civic-mindedness, Scott? That, I mean, I found it really inspiring. I just want you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so here's a relatively accessible example. We've all had to stand in line, right? I mean, so queuing up is a phenomenon that just happens. It's a feature of, you might say, a sort of limited capacity to be able to distribute goods, an agreement that we have as a people that live together, that we can say, like, look, we queue up and we wait our turn, and there's a rule that we've got. There's no cutting in line, right? And there's a difference, however, whenever we tell people not to cut line. If you are behind the person cutting you in line, we can understand why you would object, right? It's like, well, you've now been delayed in receiving the good that you've got. But it's something that I, as somebody who's in a line stander, I'm not afraid to tell people not to cut in line. But I'm actually very attentive, not to the folks in front of me. I'm very attentive to the folks behind me, because I think that it's important that the people in front of the people who cut in line, to tell them not to cut in line. Because that's now a case where I'm not benefiting from enforcing this rule, right? I'm in fact kind of paying a weird social cost of being somebody who's like, hey, don't cut the line, who didn't have anything to hang on. But in this regard, it's the respect for the line. It's the respect for the agreement that we've got with each other. What's the social good? That we have a way of being able to manage this without crowding up and making it impossible for us to have a way of distributing these sort of harder to distribute goods. And so enforcing the line cutting rule, whenever you're actually in front of the cutter, is a way of you showing that civic mindedness, that we enforce the rule, even if you don't benefit from the enforcement of the rule. And I think that the same thing goes with regards to argument. I mean, I'm sure that we've all had friends who you thought were right in the conclusions, who were on the right side of things, but for some reason didn't quite give, like, every time they gave the reasons, they were like, not correct, right? You got to the right conclusion, well done, but don't like everything that you did in between there and there was not correct. So we're on the same team, but you are not doing the thing correctly. I think that it's important that we also correct those with whom we agree. And the reason why is because even if you like the conclusions that they're getting to, one is that it maintains a kind of intellectual honesty that we've got. Because the challenge of thinking, and this is a hard problem for everybody, the challenge of being able to distinguish between whether or not you agree with where the reasons go and whether or not the reasons are good is an important distinction that we need to regularly keep in mind. There's a kind of bias that gets brought in that's sometimes called my side bias or belief bias, that thinking that because the conclusions or the things that they're getting to are correct, that the reasons are good. That's in fact one of the places where believing your own bullshit starts. Because we might say, look, You believe the things that you believe because you think that they're true. You arrived at those beliefs because of certain kinds of reasoning mechanisms. And so you must then, as a consequence, endorse those reasoning mechanisms as good because they were so good at being able to get to the truths. But that's actually rationalization. That's you saying, hey, I like the beliefs, so they must be true. I like the reasoning methods that got into it because they gave me beliefs I like so much. That's no longer critical thinking. That's actually rationalization. And the way that it actually works on us is because of the fact that why? We believe the things initially. And so criticizing those with whom we agree is in fact one of the ways of maintaining that kind of honesty and maintaining in some ways a kind of fidelity to each other. Ironically enough, it does feel weird to criticize those with whom you agree, right? It feels very strange. But the important thing here is to say that it's because we're friends of the truth that we're friends. It's because of the fact that we're trying to respect each other as, again, I keep saying rational dignity, but we're respecting each other's rational dignity. Mm-hmm. And it's in that virtue of that respect and in that dignity that we can disagree. And we can do it, without being disagreeable and so on.
Right. Great. Again, quoting from the book, the simple fact that training in logic and critical thinking doesn't guarantee any improvement in our performances in argument. In fact, as we will show, it actually makes new and unique forms of errors of reasoning possible. That is, logic, critical thinking, and fallacy theory makes new fallacies and abuses of reason possible. So there is a sense that theories of good reasoning and vocabularies pointing out how we fail at it can contribute to failures. We call this the Owl of Minerva problem, and we try to outline a few ways to mitigate its effects. So I end the quote here, and the question is, does it mean that we can be deceived or being sold a fallacy in new ways, and that's why what has been argued before can again be argued?
Yeah, man, the Owl of Minerva problem is such a disappointment. It's no way to sell critical thinking classes, by the way. If you can't say to your dean or to the students and getting ready to enroll in the class, this class is going to teach you good ways to be able to point out bad reasoning, but it's going to make new ways of bad reasoning possible for you. So congratulations. So that's a piece of terrible news, and it's a kind of tragedy. But here's how it works. So we'll just go back to the simple fact of the straw man. We're familiar with the straw man fallacy. What you do is you represent another person's reasoning as bad reasoning, and then move on. And again, the problem is that it's a false representation of their bad reasoning as bad reasoning. But here's the thing. What familiarity with fallacy theory allows, now that you've got the list of all the fallacies, you've now got a recipe for how to strawman others. That's one, right? So like once you learn the fallacies, you're like, oh man, that person is just an ad hominemer, or that person does nothing but assert the consequent. You've got a whole bunch of now names and ways to start representing how they reason. And a set of formulae, again, recipes for strawmanning others. So that's one quick version of how fallacy theory can create new fallacies. But the other one is that it looks like once we start thinking about ways that we can make errors, notice, by the way, that the very concept of fallacy creates a new kind of fallacy, which is sometimes called the fallacy, which is you detect a bunch of fallacies, even if you've correctly, without even strawmanning, even if you've correctly identified a bunch of fallacies in their reasoning, then it's possible for one to then start inferring that the other side is wrong on the basis of all their bad arguments. But that itself doesn't follow. Just because someone has got terrible reasons doesn't mean that their conclusion's false. You can have all sorts of terrible reasons for a true conclusion. Again, a couple examples. Believe what I just said, or else I'll hit you with a shovel, right? So that's an ad baculum, but it's true, right? You can have bad reasons given for, and in fact, obviously fallacious reasons given for a true conclusion. So the challenge then is to then start seeing that our capacity to be able to detect bad reasoning and even having names for it doesn't actually prevent us from reasoning badly. So we can reason about our reasoning, but we as fallible creatures, I mean, the whole reason why we had to reason about our reasoning was because of the fact that we're fallible creatures. We're fallible creatures, we make mistakes, we reason, we try to correct it, and then we reason about the reasoning to correct those errors that we make. But we bring the fallible creatures that we are at that first level up to that second level. And those, what we might call meta-argumentative fallacies, fallacies that we make when we reason about reasoning, we bring our fallible selves up to that level too. And so learning the rules of critical thinking, learning the rules of logic are not going to be panaceas. They're not going to solve all of our problems, because those tools are still nevertheless going to be deployed by fallible creatures. And what happens is that as we learn these skills, we learn to deploy them. But again, because we're fallible, we'll deploy them in error. We'll deploy them in ways that are erroneous. They'll be, given the kind of creatures that we are, there will be certain kinds of patterns to those errors. And there'll be new fallacies that we commit whenever we reason at this sort of second level. And so examples of those abound. I think that both siderism is a case of this. So persistently looking out for both sides of any issue and thinking that if there's that both sides need to be represented as legitimate, or maybe even then thinking that the truth is in between them, that's again us reasoning about reasoning. Whataboutism is another form of this, where you say, hey, you've been reasoning and giving me all sorts of reasons about this. Well, what about this other thing over here? Isn't there a kind of a conflict between these things over here that look like they're bad in a similar way? The freedom of speech fallacy is another one, where you'd say, look, I've been criticizing this, nobody's been listening, or I haven't been given the platform and nobody's responding, you're not respecting my freedom of speech. These are all bits of us reasoning about reasoning, and reasoning under, you might say, according to all of the rules that we've sort of got for our first order reasoning, but us incorrectly deploying those rules. Why? Again, because we're fallible creatures. And so there's a kind of a tragedy that I think should come, and maybe it's a tragic comedy, but the tragic comic element to this is that we learned all the critical thinking skills for us to correct the errors that we make. The problem is that because we are error-prone creatures, we will make errors whenever we try to correct ourselves.
Right.
And it happens in grammar all the time. I mean, there's an overcorrection phenomenon in English where people will default to using the first person singular nominative in almost all cases, even when it should be in the accusative. So you say something like, Kelly and I went to the mall. Kelly and I, someone gave a necklace to Kelly and me. That's what you should say. That's in the accusative. But people will often overcorrect and say Kelly and I. And so that phenomenon of being aware of the fact that there's an error that's easy to make, but then overcorrecting against that error is a phenomenon that happens in grammar. It's a phenomenon that happens in reasoning too. You become aware of the errors that are common and you overcorrect against them. That's a kind of meta.
Right, thank you. So another question is that people regard the political arguments somehow with disdain, although it might help them. In a part of the book, you say that when one feels concerned about a belief and consequently reviews one's reasons and evidence, one engages in an act of cognitive hygiene, not self-doubt, end of quote. But Scott, why is it that some people, actually most people, think that this cognitive hygiene entails self-doubt and avoid it? What is the use of arguments for those who are tired, enraged, and those who are underprivileged, if not disadvantaged, if not with disadvantaged backgrounds, except that by using arguments, we can convince them that they are not underprivileged?
Well, I guess the first point is that
actually there are two questions embedded.
Yeah, those are two. Okay. Let's start with the easier one and then I'll get to the harder one. So the easier one is distinguishing between doing the cognitive hygiene work and having self-doubt. So the first part is that one way to think about what cognitive hygiene is to think about what it would look like if you didn't do it. And a reality about ourselves, just about human minds, no mind is an exception to this. And it's the following. If you are not regularly updating your beliefs just start wandering around depending on who you last talked to and who last praised you. And so critical evaluation of your beliefs is the thing that makes them stable. This feels incorrect about us, but it is a truth about us. Namely that the only way to make sure, so if you think that you're right about something, the only way for you to be sure that your views are staying stable on that is for you to actually be engaging with other views. Because that's the point, because if you're only engaging with the folks who agree with you, it's going to feel like they're staying stable. It'll feel like it, but they won't. Your views are actually going to be pushed around, and this is the phenomenon called polarization. So group polarization is the phenomenon where if you talk to people who generally agree with you, your views will become more extreme. You'll hold more extreme versions of your view. So the examples are, if you're anti-abortion, if you hang out with more anti-abortion people and only talk to them about it, your views are going to make it so that you then think that there are fewer and fewer exceptions as you go along. You will feel as though you've been consistent in one version of that view, but you in fact have not. Okay, so that's the first thing, which is human beings, if you think that you've got the correct view, to only talking to people with whom you agree is actually the worst way for you to be able to keep the views that you've got. So if you like your views, you should actually talk to people who disagree with you. That's a crazy, ironic phenomenon, but that is a truth about human minds. Okay, so nobody's an exception to it. Now, the first thing to then say about those who are underprivileged is that one of the features of their lack of privilege is that they are regularly under the eye of those whom they disagree with. They know all too well. This is just a feature of, you might say, not just the social and political circumstances that they're on, but also the cognitive circumstances, which is that they know all too well what their oppressors think of them. In fact, one of the consistent problems of those who have been oppressed is that they have internalized the perspective of the oppressor on them. And so one of the features of that cognitive hygiene is then not that they need to be exposing themselves more to the opinions of their oppressors. They don't need any more of that. What they need is actually spaces where those who are sympathetic with them can actually be able to give them the feedback and be able to give them the evidence for them to have stable self-conceptions and be able to resist the degrading perspectives of them that are held by those who are their oppressors or those who are complicit with their oppression. And so in this regard, those who are oppressed live in a cognitive environment where they are regularly engaging with views that they disagree with. And as a consequence, what they need are stable places where they can be able to create counter evidence.
Right, but we can't conclude from that those, I mean, the more oppressed you are, the likelier it is to promote less hygiene cognitive ideas.
Well, that's what's needed then are places for them to be able to articulate their views that are actually places of what might be called epistemic resistance.
Right.
Those are places where they can find ways to undercut the picture of them that those in the dominant culture have made of them, and that it's highly likely that they have internalized.
Right. Right.
And so there need to be spaces for them. That a condition for cognitive hygiene for folks under those conditions are spaces where they are free of those criticisms, because because they live under the critical eye all the time.
Let's move to the beautiful topic of conspiracy. So, Scott, sometimes when I talk to the people promoting or at least advocating conspiracy theories, I mean, be it COVID or the banks of the world or any other example, I'm convinced, hopefully logically, that remaining in the emotional level mixed with lack of knowledge or education, causes them to have less logical conclusions, although they actually can often have right premises. I mean, their anger or fears are compelling, but also even defensible. As you say, the problem with your uncle's argument, I mean, the book has this the uncle's argument, and as you say in that argument, even though the premises are acceptable, they aren't relevant to the conclusion. And so you can agree with the premises of an argument, but still hold it not to be any good, because arguments must also be logically successful too. And yet, don't you think that the unreflected and even immature conclusions in this case should not make us not see the right premises, and more importantly, the rage, anger, or fear which has resulted in such conclusions?
Yeah. So,
I hope it was sensible, like the whole
yeah, that is a
question.
sense. I mean, and I mean, in some ways, the challenge of being able to go, because most conspiracy theories start with, you might say, perfunctory pieces of public knowledge. And then from those, tell a tale of the logically possible, but maybe not probable, from them. And the challenge is then being able to say, okay, look, where did the slip happen? Where is the slip? One of them is that it's in what is often taken to be as kind of an inference to the best explanation in cases where they say, look, they didn't give us the entire story, or we don't know all of the details of this. So take the Hunter Biden laptop case, or take so many of these where pieces of information are missing because the world is a messy place and we don't know everything. The issue in almost every one of these cases is you start off with the incomplete information, and then from a perspective of contempt, distrust, hate, but you might say having your defaults on filling in anything that you don't know is the case as something nefarious by your opponent. So you are always suspecting the worst in cases where you don't know that they haven't done something terrible. If they haven't done something terrible, if you don't know they haven't done something terrible, the presumption should be that they are. And it's this default attitude of interpreting every piece of incomplete information and filling it in with terrible suspicions on the other side that creates the conspiracy theories. And it's this ruthless consistency of contempt in these cases that creates the stories. And so in these kinds of stories where they've got some sort of cabal in the background, it's not that they don't have evidence that there's not. It's just that they don't have evidence that there's not, and they've got all of these presumptions of filling in, of inferring to the best explanation. Well, then what is this? And their best notions about best explanation are ones that fit with their presumptions about how terrible these people are. So in exactly the same way in which arguing with people with whom you agree pushes you around because you kind of like the agreement, in these cases, it's reasoning about people whom you hate and who you love to hate that actually creates these conditions of you telling worse tales of them. I mean, have you ever had think of all the arguments in the shower that you've won, right? Those shampoo bottles just get refuted so badly. But those are tales that we tell of ourselves, where we've represented the person with whom we disagree as so easily defeatable and so bad at reasoning and being bad at a fellow conversant. Well, the same thing goes with conspiracy theories. What they are, you might say, tales that we tell ourselves of how terrible our opponents are and how unscrupulous they are. And as a consequence, the good feeling that we get in representing the folks that we don't like as bad and clearly bad is the reason why it then sticks. We are driven in some ways by those feelings, that then those feelings drive us to tell those tales and endorse them because they feel good. And it's a terrible arrangement, but that's the arrangement. We've got pictures of our political opponents, our ethical opponents, and our intellectual opponents as folks who love the bad, who are deeply drawn by the false. And whenever we tell the tale of them and the things that they do, even whenever they sometimes look successful, we tell a tale that maintains that consistency of them being the kind of people that we think they are. And so the challenge then of undoing conspiracy theories and undoing a good deal of the polarization that we've got requires not just evidence, but the problem is that evidence is always going to be incomplete. You can't ever give all of the details. And as a consequence, we're going to be filling in the holes in those with the pictures of hate. What's necessary is a kind of an effective change. We need to go from a sort of an us and them to just an us.
Right.
But the challenge then is to just say, how did we do that? And again, I've got the cognitive stuff pretty straight, but man, the effective stuff, where the hate, where the contempt lies, that's a harder problem to fix.
But Scott, it's very interesting for me that this group polarization actually can be the result of at least two different mechanisms. I mean, namely, with those people with whom you agree and those people who you disagree. So as if the problem or the obstacle in this kind of cognitive hygiene on the front of the people with whom you agree is the politeness, and with those who you disagree is the hatred. So, like, I mean, both of them are obstacles to critical thinking, like politeness on the side of those who agree and the hatred of those who disagree. So yeah, just it just sprang to my mind once I was reading that chapter. Yeah, if you have any note.
Oh yeah, I think that this is the reason. I mean, this is the reason why norms of civility should constrain us. And it's simply because of the fact that, look, even in cases where you hold the view that someone holds in contempt, the problem is that if the objective is to be able to get the evidence out and play the cognitive hygiene role for us that it needs to play, expressing that contempt is going to have the opposite effect.
Right.
Not just on them,
right,
but on you.
On us, right.
And that's I mean, think of how unhappy a circumstance that is. But the challenge is that, again, recognizing the minds that we've got, that's a temptation that we have to resist. Now, again, that's us in some ways being in a kind of a position where there's not just a kind of an injustice that can happen where people aren't believed on the basis of their identities, or an injustice where people are represented as having worse reasons. But now that's a kind of an intellectual or a cognitive or an epistemic injustice. But there are other kinds of injustices too that are a consequence and downstream from this, which what might be called affective injustices, which is that given how objectionable certain things are, you are now in a position where where you feel the reaction and the outrage at something that's been said or proposed. But for the sake of the cognitive hygiene of yourself and others, you have to keep it down.
Interesting.
Now, again,
right.
that is
right.
It's a horrible burden. I think it's an
Right,
awful burden,
right.
and it's worse for those who are oppressed.
Right.
It's worse for those who are oppressed.
Definitely. Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I think that the tragedy of the circumstance is that if the more that we make exceptions for ourselves and those with whom we agree to express outrage, the greater the polarization is going to be.
Mm.
Both in ourselves and others.
Right.
And so it's I think that it's an injustice, and I think that it's a tragedy, but it's nevertheless the circumstance that we've got, which is the more we express the outrage, the more we become unreachable.
Interesting. Let's go again to civic-mindedness, Scott. I have the impression that, again, it's an impression, intuition. Like, let's discuss it. I have the impression that once one cannot experience reciprocal, let's call it civic-mindedness, two things might happen. Admittedly, I'm talking about it from an Iranian diaspora position. Either one moves out. I mean, you cannot fulfill this civic-mindedness in your place, at your home, in your country. So either one move out and transforms that civic-mindedness to a kind of world-mindedness, or I'm unable to experience civic-mindedness at home. I stay there and I will seek like-mindedness. So when I'm not able to experience civic-mindedness democratically in my country, I might move out and look for the like-mindedness, like-minded people around, like abroad. But on the other hand, again, and the end of this strange intuition is that, on the other hand, something else can be experienced here, and that is you move to a democratic place abroad where civic-mindedness does not guarantee necessarily a world-mindedness.
Wow. Yeah. So again, that strikes me as a tragic choice too. And I recognize all the costs that come with this. In the United States, this has been experienced small scale because of the polarization in the various particular states in the United States, and there've been some flights of liberals from conservative states and conservatives from liberal states, but nothing on the scale and with the severity that you're talking about. Because one of the challenges that one has when one thinks about exit is not just the costs that one pays for oneself when one leaves, but also those who are left behind who can't. And so any of these kinds of decisions are ones where you say, look, I have to get out for me, but do I stay for them? And I think that those choices, again, are going to be ones that I cannot imagine how just existentially dreadful those must have been for anyone who fled the tyranny that they were experiencing. I think that upon arriving at a place where you can experience civic-mindedness, but not, you might say, the global perspective that you would hope would then be there, would be another crushing disappointment. Because, look, injustice anywhere deserves to be called out. And especially if you've come from a place of injustice, your knowledge of that should be something that should be relevant to and accessible to and urgent for those who care for justice, no matter where you go. And I can only imagine the disappointment that anyone arriving and finding the civic virtues, but not, you might say, the global intellectual virtues, are ones that would be greatly disappointing. I think that the benefit, though, and the upside, at least to the second one, is that civic virtues do have an on-ramp to the global virtues. So again, the thought is that if we've got the civic intellectual virtues, we're trying to create in us We're trying to deliberate together as to what the best path for us together is. Often those are global questions. What's the best version of we? One that stands up for global justice and human rights, no matter where they are. And so my hope would be that those who are in circumstances where there are civically good virtues, they can make the case for the more global virtues on the other side.
I don't have your video. Oh, I have it now. I have it now. So, and a couple of questions, like 1, 2 questions left.
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience. I really.
Everything's great. This is a super conversation. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. So, I start with a kind of impertinent book to make it a bit relevant to another question, a part of the book that David Mazzella, in his book, The Making of Modern Cynicism, contends that one of the functions of cynicism, or better to say, one of the targets of cynicism is institutionalization and the gap between institutions and the beliefs which have shaped them. I start with that book because one part of the book has been devoted to hypocrisy, and I think that hypocrisy can be a very big obstacle to cognitive hygiene, and especially when it comes to minorities, that can be a bigger obstacle. So, but in your point of view, some parts of the book are also devoted to cynics, and I quote you. The cynic must admit that non-cynical argument and reasoning is possible, else there can't be a set of good reasons for being a cynic in the first place, end of quote. Therefore, global just is cynicism defeats itself because just is cynicism about reason and argument is something that if you take the view on and then apply it to itself, can't see itself as a kind of cognitive success. So, what's the place of cynics in your theory, and why they, if I'm allowed to say, argue badly?
Yeah. So, yeah, the argument against so argumentative cynics are folks who just think that argument just is eliciting assent or pushing people around, getting what you want. And so argument just is a kind of manipulative program. And so the purpose of studying argument, if you are an argumentative cynic, is really the learning the skills and the art of manipulation. So, the piece that you quoted is a kind of self-refutation problem, a kind of they're hoist on their own petard kind of argument, which is that if you think that that cynical point of view is a kind of cognitive success, it has to be a cognitive success on the basis of certain kinds of reasons, which it looks like if you're a just is cynic, that just means that you have manipulated yourself into something. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a cognitive success. In fact, it's highly likely that it's not. So, okay, so that's the role that the just is cynic is playing. Your question as to what they are, or what kind of role that they've got in the theory, is in some ways to show the unavoidability of looking at oneself as having intellectual dignity, that you are out for the true, that you are out to follow the best reasons, that you want to do the good, and that your objective in reasoning and trying to think things through, even in becoming a cynic, one is doing one's best to get what's right. And so the thought is supposed to be that if we start with the thought that something along those lines is an unavoidable feature of our reasoning, that we are motivated to try to get what's true and to follow the best reasons, and that even trying to say that nobody does that has a kind of a trip on your own tongue kind of problem, right? That is on the one hand a kind of a clarion call for the ethic of honesty and intellectual honesty. But it's also a place where, in a kind of idealist kind of spirit, we're highlighting how you can be disappointed in yourself and others for being complicit with or being complacent with reasons that you're pretty sure aren't really good. And it's in those kinds of cases where you can say, look, I should be thinking harder about this. And we've got so many places in our lives where it's like, look, I really needed to know more about this before I voted, or I really needed to know more about this before I had that conversation with someone with whom I disagree,
Right.
or I really just needed to know more about this just to be responsible, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're naturally curious creatures. We want to know stuff. And there's a reason why infotainment is still entertaining. It's like you're getting information. There's one reason why it's entertaining, because it plays to your prejudices and things like that. But there's another reason why it's like, look, we still love the truth. And so the role that the cynic plays there is someone who has denied in some way that spark of intellectual dignity that in some ways looks like has to drive all of us.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The last point is just that, like, the cynic in those sorts of cases is not like the classical Diogenes of Sinope cynic or anything like that. He's someone who we think is on our side. It's the contemporary appropriation of the term cynic.
Mm-hmm.
The person who thinks that it's nothing but self-interest and the manipulation. That is not what the ancient cynics were about. So just as a side note about that, someone might have been confused about that and said, I'm a great admirer of Diogenes of Sinope, the cynic, but that's a very different.
Sure. So Scott, my last question is that the book starts with like criticizing this Platonic notion of government when it comes to, because the concept of democracy is not actually appreciated by Plato. But one of the consequences of this criticism is that what to do with expertise. So the thing is that in his book, I mean, another book, again, if I'm allowed to quote, is that in his book, Crisis of Expertise, Gil Eyal, Columbia University, highlights the relationship between science and politics. The internet has encouraged people to feel that they don't need expertise. Eyal argues that what needs to be explained is not a one-sided mistrust of expert, but a two-headed push-me-pull-you of unprecedented reliance on science and experience on the one hand, coupled with increased skepticism and dismissal of scientific finding and expert opinion on the other hand. So to what extent do you think that such a crisis is real and of significance to philosophy?
Yeah, so I think to philosophy, I think that crisis is pretty significant, because philosophy, and I think a good deal of the intellectual culture of many democracies, is that we're looking for, you might say, people exercising their individual judgment, and in both, and particularly in democracies where the objective of state protection of conscience is about protecting individual conscience. The thought is, look, as Winston Churchill had rightly in some ways observed, the best case against democracy is 5 minutes with the average voter. States can't take away that average voter's right to vote. And so the problem of voter ignorance is, on the one hand, a downstream consequence of the thought that we respect people's conscience. And we don't tell people that they have to pass a literacy test, or they don't tell people that they have to have read all of the things before they get to vote. That it's in respecting people's freedom and not holding them under certain kinds of scrutiny before they get to walk into the ballot box that we create this problem. And in some ways, it's out of respect for their rational dignity. One of the things, and again, I think that Rob Talese and I do our best in the book to even capture the disappointment, the Platonic disappointment. Again, Plato's got intellectual aspirations. Plato thinks that we're all driven by a kind of that spark of dignity inside of us. He just thinks that the way that you respect that spark of dignity is that you defer to experts. And he thinks that that's the problem of democracies, is that we don't. And I think that the challenge for us in democracies, given the fact that, again, given the simple fact of the intellectual division of labor, you can't figure everything out. All of these people who talk about, like, in the COVID cases, do your own research, and the response was, tell me about your lab, right? How'd you get the funding, right? Those are not cases where you're actually there's an illusion of doing your own research. And so a reality, I think, that anyone who's defending democracy as a place where one can actually have intellectual successes needs to answer Plato's challenge. Plato's challenge is a significant challenge. The challenge that we see with the challenge of 5 minutes with the 5 minutes with the average voter is the Churchill challenge is a legitimate challenge. The problem of voter ignorance is a problem. And the answer, I think, is correct, which is the way that you respect your rational dignity is to recognize that you can't do everything. You can't know everything. The objective then is to be able to critically be able to identify who to defer to. And so that's in some ways consistent with democracy. The objective then is to just be able to say, look, there's the illusion of thinking for yourself in so many things, doing your research. But what was often the research that these folks did? Watching a bunch of other YouTube videos made by people who they agreed with. That's not research. That's not research at all, right? There's a sort of the illusion of research itself is a problem. And so the challenge for democracies is, on the one hand, being able to respect individual intellectual liberties, but being able to recognize that individuals can't know everything. It's just not a thing that we can do. We rely on each other for so much. And being able to do that appropriately and responsibly is the key to actually being able to manage your life and to actually respect your own intellectual dignity, recognizing that there are limits to it, and instead of falling for the illusions that you can do.
Right. Wonderful, great, a wonderful answer to the question, and also a wonderful chance that I had with you, Scott. That was my pleasure for this illuminating and interesting talk and exchange. Not only the book, but also the talk was really great.
I was really thrilled to get the invitation. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for your time and for your questions. This was delightful.
That was my pleasure, Scott. I hope I will have a chance to come back to you again in future with excuse of another book, or yeah.
I've got a couple in the pipe, so I'll make sure to let you know when they come out. I'd love to talk to you again. Thank you.
Okay, so have a great time and a great day. I think it's a day I still
day here in Nashville.
Right. So good time. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.